Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be something a little different, and it's a video that I'm pretty excited about. In fact, I've been working on the content for this video for over a year now. Today, I'm going to be talking about feeding birds at your home. If you've ever wanted to set up a feeder, but you don't quite know where to start, this is going to be the video for you. Now, I'm publishing this in the fall, which makes it the perfect time for you to consider setting out your feeders, at least for those of you watching in the northern hemisphere. Many birds are in the middle of migrating to their winter habitats, meaning that if you get started now, you can be ready to support your local birds, see visiting migrants, and you'll have established feeders out there when the weather gets cold and the going gets tough for many of the birds in our area. In this video, I'll talk through a fairly comprehensive list of topics, including whether it's safe to feed birds, the different types of bird feeders, the different types of bird food, bird baths, cleaning and maintenance, how to deal with pests, and more. If you're just looking for specific topics from that list, I'll also include chapter markings in the video, so feel free to skip down to just what you need. Okay, so I want to start by answering two common questions, and these are questions that might make you hesitant to feed birds at all. Number one, is it safe to feed birds in your yard? And number two, are these birds going to get too reliant on seed? Are they going to lose their instincts, forget to migrate, things like that? I actually want to dive into that second question first, and there is no need to worry. Birds do visit feeders the most often during the winter when times are tough, but their natural instincts are still going to drive them to mate, to nest, to migrate, and to find seed and to find food, and there's no evidence that feeders are going to override or ruin any of those instincts. In fact, there was a big study done of 348 black-capped chickadees in Wisconsin a few years ago, and the goal was to answer this exact question. And what researchers did was they monitored chickadees that visited feeders and chickadees that didn't visit feeders, and they compared them. And they found that the chickadees who visited feeders only got 20% of their daily calories from the feeders, the other 80% still from out in the wild. But when they compared these chickadees who visited feeders to the ones who did not, the ones who did stop at the feeders were 30% more likely to survive a harsh Wisconsin winter. The efforts of people to help these birds was ultimately a net positive to their survival, and it didn't hurt them in any way. Now, to circle back to the question, is feeding birds safe for the birds? The answer is yes, but with conditions. While there's no evidence that the actual act of feeding birds is harmful to them in any way, it's really important to call out that if you are going to put out feeders, it's critical that you pay attention to the feeders, clean them regularly, and I urge you to be mindful about feeder placement. To say it another way, feeding birds is safe for them, but being careless about feeding them will be bad for the birds. Dirty and moldy feeders can make birds sick and spread disease, and poorly placed feeders can contribute to window strikes, which is one of the leading causes of bird deaths. What I'm trying to say here is that it is paramount that you are mindful as you set up and tend to your feeders. So with all of that said, if you're ready to start feeding birds and you're committed to putting in the work to make sure that you're responsible, there are three necessary components that you should consider when thinking about attracting and feeding birds at home. You're going to want to think about food, you're going to want to think about water, and you're going to want to think about shelter. We're going to spend the majority of the video talking about food, but I will take a quick moment to give you some of my thoughts about water and shelter too. With that said, let's get into it, starting with food. So let's go ahead and start talking about food. I'm going to break this section up into a few parts. First, we'll talk about the variety of feeders that are out there and what types might be best for you. Then, I'll talk about the types of food that are out there and what I recommend. Finally, I'll give you some of my thoughts about cleaning and placing feeders to keep them safe, as well as how I deal with pests and unwanted feeder visitors. When shopping for feeders, there are a plethora of options out there, and it can be a bit overwhelming. Let's talk through the most common types. Table feeders. Table feeders are the most basic type of feeder, and they attract the largest variety of bird. A table feeder can be anything from a sheet of plywood to a deck railing to a hanging tray. I personally use an upside down aged whiskey barrel in my yard. I love the variety of birds that this attracts, but the easy access to the barrel does also attract rodents. I also keep a hanging tray in my yard, and I protect it from these rodents by using a squirrel baffle, and sometimes I need two. Squirrels and chipmunks are cute, but they do drive away birds and they eat way more seed. I prefer to keep the seed in the tray protected and just let the squirrels and the chipmunks have the droppings that fall on the ground. If you're looking for a single feeder option to get started that will attract the most variety of birds, I just go ahead and start with a simple tray feeder like this one, and I'd encourage you to pick up at least one squirrel baffle to protect it. These feeders can also be overrun by aggressive pest birds like starlings, grackles, and cowbirds. And if you find that you have a problem with these pest birds, what I recommend is just taking the tray away for a few days. These birds typically travel in flocks and they send out scouts in the morning. And if these scouts find your tray, you can be sure that more are going to follow later in the day. So leaving it hidden or inside for a few days just encourages these flocks to move on. You can also try different seed varieties or mixes that these birds don't like to eat, but I'll get into that more in a minute. Tube feeders are long cylindrical tubes that have perches and several feeding ports. These are very user-friendly from a bird standpoint and great for smaller birds like finches, chickadees, and titmice. I like to place mine in a cage so that only smaller birds can actually fit inside. This keeps the squirrels away and it allows me to save my squirrel baffles for other poles. I personally avoid buying the really large tube feeders, by the way, because the seeds inside easily get moldy before the birds can eat them all. Finch feeders. There's also a version of the tube feeders that is completely made of mesh, and it's great if you like goldfinches. Along the same lines, by the way, you can buy these mesh socks that are filled with Niger seed that finches love, and you can hang them somewhere around your mesh feeder. I actually keep mine hanging on a crepe myrtle near my kitchen window, and I get to see goldfinches all day long. Hopper feeders. Hopper feeders have a central compartment that gets filled with seed that then dispenses out of hoppers on the side. These often have cages for suet attached to them as well. These are great for perching birds, and you might even get lucky and see buntings or grosbeaks on these hoppers in the springtime. The suet will attract woodpeckers, some warblers, and nuthatches as well. Globe feeders. Globe feeders are caged spheres full of seed. They're great for smaller birds that can hang upside down like chickadees, titmice, nuthatches, and goldfinches. When larger birds are overrunning the other feeders, having globe feeders around gives your smaller birds a place to hang out and keep on eating. By the way, I found that putting suet nuggets into these seems to be quite effective. Hummingbird feeders. I could make an entire separate video about hummingbird feeders, and I probably will at some point, so I'll keep the details here high level. Also, unfortunately for at least my area, most of the hummingbirds are already migrating away for the winter, so for many of you this is going to have to serve as advice for next year. You can get hummingbird feeders all over the place, and they come in many shapes and sizes. When shopping for one, my advice is just to look for feeders that have bee guards on them to prevent swarms of bees and wasps from taking them over. I also like to buy a little cup like this one too, to fill with water that acts as a little moat and keeps colonies of ants from overtaking the feeder. In terms of the nectar itself, avoid the pre-mixed hummingbird nectar that is dyed red, as the red dyes have been shown to actually hurt hummingbirds. Mix your own sugar water mix with 1 part sugar to 4 parts water, and make sure to swap out the water every few days to prevent the sugar water from becoming moldy. Okay, so now let's talk about food, starting with what probably first comes to mind when you think about feeding birds: seeds. There are a lot of options out there, ranging from bags of sunflower seeds to seed mixes that you might see in the grocery store. Right off the bat, let me just come out and say that you should avoid most seed mixes. Companies pad them with these little round filler seeds called wheat milo, and wheat milo is cheap, and it just helps to fill up the bag, make it seem more full, but unfortunately, almost no birds eat it. With the exception of maybe blackbirds and doves, most other birds just kick it onto the ground where it turns into unsightly weeds. It's total junk, total filler, and you're better off avoiding it. Spicy seeds. Along with seed mixes, I'll typically see spicy seed mixes in the stores too. The idea here is that because birds can't taste the spices in the mix, it's going to discourage rodents like squirrels who can taste these spices from eating your seed. These are branded as an alternative to buying squirrel baffles. While this might be true, and while some brands might actually work to discourage squirrels and other rodents from eating the seeds, I personally haven't found these to work very well for me, and I've had better luck with just using well-placed baffles. But if you've had any luck with any spicy seed brands or spicy seed mixes, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments down below. Black oil sunflower seed. If I had to recommend one well-rounded seed for you to get, especially if you're just starting out, it would just be to get a simple bag of black oil sunflower seeds. Black oil sunflower seed is just about the most universal favorite for birds out there as there can be, and these seeds are full of important fats that birds need to stay safe and warm during the harsh cold winter. No mess mixes. Now it's a little expensive, but one thing I recommend is getting a no mess mix from your local bird seed supply store. These are specialty blended to be full of nice seeds, and they have none of that wheat milo filler. I typically put my no mess blend into my caged tube feeders to make it last longer. Niger seed. Now I mentioned Niger before. It's this great thistle-like food that goldfinches love. If you want to attract goldfinches, adding this to a sock or a mesh tube feeder like we talked about before is a great choice. Suet. Suet is a type of fat that many birds especially need in the winter to stay warm. It's going to attract a variety of birds including woodpeckers, but it can also attract pest birds. If you're having trouble with pests, what I recommend is buying a cheap cage for your suet. Usually you can get these on Amazon for like $2 or $3. Leave the suet in its plastic container and hang the cage so that the open side of the suet is facing downwards. This is going to limit the birds that can visit to smaller birds that can hang upside down and will help to prevent grackles and starlings and squirrels from getting into your suet. White safflower. If you're really struggling with pest birds, consider swapping out your black oil sunflower seed for white safflower. The key is to buy the white safflower seed that is still in the shell. Squirrels don't like it, and starlings and grackles are legitimately too lazy to shell and eat them. I typically will start out with black oil sunflower seed as the weather starts to turn cold, but when the flocks of the pest birds start to overtake my feeders, I go ahead and switch the tray feeders out to white safflower, and I reserve my black oil sunflower seeds to protected or caged feeders. Peanuts. If you put out shelled peanuts, you will almost certainly attract corvids like jays and crows. These corvids go actually literally nuts for peanuts. My blue jays will team up and take as many peanuts into hiding as they can, usually within an hour of me putting them out. Mealworms. Okay, last but not least, many birds like bluebirds depend on the nutrients from worms to survive, and they might not be interested in seeds. For these birds, I'm going to typically lay out some dried mealworms onto my tray feeders. Cleaning feeders. Clean your feeders once or twice a month, or just as needed. You can use water in a spray bottle for relatively clean feeders, or a 9-part water to 1-part chlorine bleach solution in a spray bottle for feeders that need to be sanitized. Just be sure that the feeders are completely dry before you refill them. Use a bottle brush to get hard to reach places, and make sure that you dispose of any old seed in a place where birds won't find it. I like to keep all of my supplies in a bucket so that I can easily make my rounds and clean everything as I refill it. Along with spray bottles and bottle brushes, I'll bring paper towels, rags, and plastic bags so that I can dispose of that old and moldy seed in the trash and away from any birds. Placing feeders. When deciding where to place your feeders, be especially mindful. You want to put them in a place where seed droppings won't attract rodents and lure them into your home. You'll also want to be mindful that they aren't in a place where birds will fly into and strike windows. If your feeders are near highly reflective windows, consider placing bird decals or shades onto the window to minimize reflections. It's also recommended to place your feeders either closer than 3 feet to the window, which will cause birds to slow down when they're landing on the feeder, or further than 10 feet away to minimize these chances of window strikes. Water. Birds need water for hydration, temperature control, and flight. They're drawn to the sound of moving water, and it's especially important in cold winter months when water can be frozen. I recommend finding a bird bath that has a shallow basin that's around 3 inches deep. Waterlogged birds can't escape predators easily, so if it's deeper than 3 inches, they're going to avoid it. The bottom of the basin should have a rough surface. You can help by adding a pile of thin, flat rocks to create ledges and small pools. Don't use gravel or sand. You can use a jiggler, a dripper, or a recirculating pump to add the sight and sound of moving water as well. Just avoid using heated bird baths. You should clean your bird bath whenever it's visibly dirty and at least every 4 to 5 days to prevent mosquito eggs from hatching. I actually recommend putting these mosquito dunks into the water periodically as well. This is a safe, natural way to prevent mosquito eggs from hatching in the water, and it's in no way harmful to the birds. Shelter. I can't really say too much here because this advice is going to be very specific to where you live. Generally speaking though, birds need safe places to hide, and providing a variety of plants that will grow year-round will keep birds safe and happy in your yard for years to come. I'll go ahead and link in the description below a link to the native plant database to help get you started in finding some local native plants for your area. All right, everyone. Well, that wraps up another video for this week. I hope you found that helpful. I hope that you are inspired to go out and feed some of the birds in your neighborhood. Let me know in the comments down below which parts of the video you thought were helpful, any tips that you've got for feeding birds in your area, and what you have found to be successful. Thanks again for watching. I will see you next week for another video. Don't forget to hit that like button, that subscribe button. It really does help the channel to grow, and I'll see you around. Thanks. Take care.